Okay. Om, Om, Om. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karava Vahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvabhutaguhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarvavide Namaha. Om. Very good. Welcome to you all. Welcome also to the students attending this class online. Last week we had to cancel some. Oh, thank you. I keep forgetting that. I'm glad you don't. Good. We didn't meet last week. I was not feeling so well, so we continue today. The class before that, we had introduced the current topic, which is that of pramana. So as we continue today, I'm going to presume that you watched that class. You know that if you miss a class, you can go back and watch that. So pramana, an instrument of knowledge, like sight is an instrument for knowing form. Inference is an instrument for knowing the smoke on the mountain indicates the presence of fire. And scriptures are an instrument for knowing your true nature as sat-chit-ananda, atma. Which leads us to the question of the first verse we're going to see. I have to back up. There it is. So we'll pick up the thread here. Adhyakshasyapi siddhisyat. Adhyakshasyapi siddhisyat. I didn't push another button here. This button. Okay. Pramanena vinaivava. Pramanena nivaiva. Vinaswasya prasiddhistu. Vinaswasya prasiddhistu. Nagyam pratyupayujyate. Nyagnyam pratyupayujyate. So, Shankara, this is such an important question that he introduces. We've mentioned Purvapaksha Siddhanta. You know that it can be done in an informal way. That is, Shankara doesn't need to elaborately develop a point of view. Sometimes he may just mention very briefly the question, because the question is one that is familiar. So the question, I don't want to steal Shankara's thunder, so I won't. So we'll just let him describe the question. He says, Adhyakshasya, and it's a little unusual sense of the word, because Adhyaksha means a guy in charge, so to speak. Here it refers to consciousness. Please remember, words always, always, always derive their meaning in context. You can't say, but doesn't that word mean this, or doesn't that word mean that? It doesn't mean anything out of context. Okay, so adhyakshasya, for pure consciousness. He says, for the siddhisyat, for the establishment of pure consciousness, or let me turn it into a question, since that's his intention. Is pure consciousness, adhyaksha, is it siddhisyat, is it established pramanena, by a pramana, vina evava, or without a pramana? Is consciousness, pure consciousness, established with a pramana or without a pramana? Now, you might jump at the answer, well, wait a minute, isn't all this Vedanta meant to reveal the nature of consciousness? And that without Vedanta, there's no atma-jnanam, self-knowledge. So Shastra is a pramana, is a means of knowledge for gaining atma-jnanam, knowledge of the true self, which is true, but, always a but. And here the but is, do you know whether or not you're conscious right now? Do you know Vedanta? Do you require the teachings of Vedanta to know that until you came here for class, you thought you were unconscious? Silly, right? So this is what Shankara gets into. He says his answer is vina, without a pramana, swasya prasiddhihi. Swasya, for your own consciousness. There is siddhi. It is established. It is self-established, self-evident. In Sanskrit, we use the word swata siddhi. Consciousness is self-established. That you are a conscious being is a self-evident truth. And that's what Shankara refers to here. So you are consciousness. But do you know that the consciousness that you know right now, the consciousness that's self-established, do you know that it was uncreated and therefore is undying? Do you know that it's not stuck inside your body, but instead pervades the universe? Do you know that it's utterly unaffected by whatever happens in your mind? Do you know that consciousness is the same as the underlying reality because of which everything exists? So you know that you are a conscious being, but this other stuff you indeed may not know. This is an odd situation. Notice that consciousness is understood in general, but not the details. You know you're a conscious being. You don't know what kind of conscious being you are. For our Sanskrit students, general knowledge is called, and by the way, these are complicated technical terms, so don't worry about them if you're not a Sanskritist. General knowledge is called apatita jnanam, knowledge which is apatita, which is not a common term. That which just happens is like your first glimpse, your first idea. And then what we're after now is vishesha jnanam, specific, particular knowledge. And if you haven't heard these terms before, don't worry about them. They're not important. So to understand how consciousness can be partially known, which is our situation, that's the reason the metaphor of Atma being veiled is so common. First of all, it's a metaphor. There's no veil inside. But the significance of a veil is that when a lady puts that veil over her head, she can see through it. So the veil covers her. In fact, not only can she see, you can see through it too. You can see the outline of her face. Even in the burqa, which is not transparent, they have these little windows you can look through. So the burqa doesn't completely cover you, but partially covers you. The veil is different. It's like semi-opaque, I guess would be the word for it. So in either case, the veil partially covers the nature of Atma like a veil, so that Atma is known in general and the details are not known. But what is the American English idiom? The devil lies in the details. And that's true here. Knowing that you are a conscious being doesn't solve the problem of suffering. Knowing the true nature of that consciousness is a solution to the problem of suffering, which is what Shankaracharya says in the last here. He says, at the end of the third line, but na agnyam pratyupayujyate. Actually, I don't like my translation here. Agnyam here I would take as an ignorant person. It can actually, for a Sanskritist, I think there's only one that I know about here. It's a bahuvrihi. Agnyam, one who doesn't have knowledge, an ignorant person. And agnyam, maybe not, I take that back. What I'm trying to play with this grammar a little bit. Anyway, it simply means that without a pramana, na pratiyujyate, that's not applicable, that's not helpful, that's not enough. Agnyam, for an ignorant person, it's not enough to remove the veil of ignorance. Let me explain what I mean, what Shankara means. You have kind of knowledge. You are a conscious being. Is that knowledge enough to remove the veil of ignorance? Well, the veil of ignorance prevents you from knowing that your consciousness isn't stuck inside your body, is all pervasive, and the other things I mentioned before. So clearly, your general knowledge that you are a conscious being is not sufficient to remove the veil of ignorance. Your general knowledge is what you got in spite of the veil of ignorance, right? So it's not enough to remove the veil of ignorance, and that therefore you require a pramana. Okay, and the pramana is the scriptures here as taught by Sri Shankara. Just a point here. Excuse me just a moment. Very interesting, the interpretation taken by the followers of what's called Neo-Advaita. The followers of Neo-Advaita say, why are we breaking our heads with all this Shankaracharya stuff? And they say that consciousness is already present in your experience, which is correct. They say that you already know that consciousness, in a general sense. They won't say that part, but they will say, you already know consciousness, so therefore what do you need all this Vedanta stuff? Consciousness is already known to you, so you just have to... They actually say this. You have to stop saying you're unenlightened. You already know you're conscious, so therefore you're enlightened. How's that? Not very convincing, and that's a huge problem. And it's a common problem for the followers of this new school of thought, Neo-Advaita. For this reason, they see no value in the pramana, in the systematic usage of these teachings to remove that veil of ignorance. Okay, next. Tasyaiva jnanatvam tasyaiva jnatvam chet tasyaiva jnatvam jnatavyatve jnatatve nyamitir bhavet jnatatat Anyasyaivagnatayam cha Anyasyaivagnatayam cha Tadvijnane dhruva bhavet Tadvijnane dhruva. Shankara wants to clarify what he said in the prior verse. It's an extremely important point. Tasya, for that Atma, for consciousness, he says, chet, if, ishtam chet, if it is taken that, tasya, for consciousness, for Atma, ajñatvam, the state of ignorance. If the state of ignorance is accepted for atma, is what it literally means, and what he's saying is, if you were to suppose that ignorance belongs to consciousness, if ignorance truly belongs to consciousness, then Shankara says, jnata tve, for knowing that consciousness, anya mitihi bhavet. Miti here means pramana. It's a synonym. Anya mitihi, another pramana, bhavet, would be required, jnata vye, for that atma to be known. What he's saying is, if we need to preface this a little bit to make it clear. That so-called veil of ignorance, where is it? We say it's covering atma. So if it's covering atma, then it belongs to atma, like a veil belongs to a lady? Where is this ignorance? Who possesses this ignorance? Shankara makes short of it. He says that ignorance belongs to the jiva, the person asking the question. And in a little bit more detailed way right now, we could say that ignorance, the locus of ignorance in this discussion is the mind, not consciousness. In fact, look at this. Are you conscious of ignorance? And to make that's a rather obscure question. So I remember Puja Swamiji used to put it like this. Do you know Chinese? And then he'll say, well, how do you know? How do you know that you don't know? You are aware of your own ignorance. If you are aware of your own ignorance, it means you are here, ignorance is there. You are consciousness, ignorance is in the mind and known to you. Therefore, you know what you don't know. In this case, you don't know Chinese. So that veil of ignorance is known to consciousness. If that consciousness in the first half, Shankara says, suppose that veil of consciousness is stuck to Atma. Well, that would be a problem. If darkness were associated with the sun, it wouldn't shine. But on a day like today, darkness is not associated with the sun. Darkness is associated with storm clouds. Does the sun shine right now during the storm clouds? Absolutely. So you see, darkness doesn't belong to the sun. Darkness belongs to the storm clouds. The so-called veil of ignorance doesn't belong to Atma. When we use that term, veil covering Atma, it is a metaphor. Helps us understand what's going on. It's not what's really happening. So, that veil of ignorance is not stuck to Atma. That veil of ignorance is in the mind. And that's what he points out in the second half of this verse. He says, anyasya. He says, but if that consciousness belongs to something other than Atma, anya, something other than Atma, if cha, and, if that consciousness, anyasya eva, to something else, ajñātayam, if ignorance, if the state of being, literally, the state of being unknown, we'll just say ignorance. If ignorance belongs to something else, like the mind, then tadvijñāne, then to know it. To know here, knowing means removing ignorance. It's not that we want to, remember we've talked about the difference between this knowledge and information. And it's a common mistake we make. We think of knowledge as information. And Conventional knowledge is largely information in a general sense, but that's not our topic here. Our topic here is atma-jnanam, self-knowledge. The value of self-knowledge is in its ability to remove that veil of ignorance. So, anyasya tad-vijnane, to know Atma, meaning to remove the veil of ignorance that partially covers Atma, dhruva pramana bhavet. Then dhruva, certainly, a pramana is necessary. So you can see this is an unusual situation in that Atma is partially known. And that leads to a lot of confusion, and especially for these so-called the followers of the so-called Neo-Advaita. So, you know you are a conscious being. The full nature of that consciousness is not known to you. Therefore, we require a pramana, we require a scriptural means of knowledge to remove that so-called veil of ignorance. And this ends a topic which began actually quite a few verses ago, where Shankara began with the question, is pure negation enough? Just a quick comment. This is a sophisticated text. It's not an introductory text. So we're actually in the midst of a refutation of Buddhist thought. It sounds our discussion today has been very Vedantic so far. Next verse is going to be a little different, but so far it's a pure Vedantic discussion. But several verses ago, we saw a question where Shankara introduced, where he said, is pure negation enough for enlightenment? Remember that? It's probably maybe 2-3 classes ago. Is pure negation enough? And he introduced that question because Buddhists are how can we say? They are masters of negation, Buddhists. Well, we use lots of negation too, but Buddhists are masters of negation because that's all they can do. They can only negate. Why? They don't have access to these teachings. They've rejected the validity of the Vedas. Therefore, they don't have access to this pramana. So that's why I say that Buddhists are masters of negation. And the reason I'm bringing this up is now we're coming to the end of that question which was raised long ago, that question that challenged the Buddhists, is negation enough? Can you get enlightened without a pramana, just through logic, the logic that's wielded very strongly by the Buddhists? That topic comes to an end, and we begin a new topic. Let's chant it just so I can get back on what happened here. There it is. So we'll just chant it first, then I'll introduce the topic. Abhinno pihi buddhyatma, abhinno pihi buddhyatma, viparyasita darshanaihi, right. Grahya grahaka samvitti, grahya grahaka samvitti, bedhavaniva lakshyate, vedya. Good. Viparyasita is the word, not viparyasita darshanaihi. Okay. Before I drag you through this verse, the topic is a little tricky. Let's get in. So far, the previous refutation was of the school of thought, was mostly of the Buddhist school of thought known as Shunyavada. And we're not going to go back and discuss all that. I think I gave some introduction to it. Many of you already understand it. Today, we go on to Shankara is going to refute another school of thought, another Buddhist school of thought known as Vijnanavada or Kshanika Vijnanavada. Before we get into this, let's remember, why is Shankara defeating these other points of view? Does he want to prove Vedanta is best? You know, it's very fashionable nowadays with this Hindutva movement to look at Shankara as the savior of Vedanta. He restored Vedanta teachings in India that had been robbed away by those terrible Buddhists. This is kind of this Hindutva kind of perspective. And there's nothing wrong. It's wonderful that they revere Shankara in this way, but it becomes a little politicized, which makes me extremely uncomfortable when any religious or spiritual teaching becomes politicized. Shankara wasn't involved in a political movement to restore Hinduism. Shankara lived at a time and place where Buddhism was widely accepted, and please understand, he is not debating Buddhists here. Who were Shankaracharya's teachings? Students. Shankaracharya's students, were they Buddhists or Hindus? Pretty obvious, right? So then, don't look at these verses as a debate with the Buddhists. He's not trying to put Buddhism down. He doesn't care. He's teaching Vedanta. But a real common mode of teaching is Purva-paksha Siddhanta, to introduce opposing points of view for the sake of negating them. And remember the metaphor we gave long ago. The traditional metaphor of Purva-paksha Siddhanta is, if you put a fence post in the ground, you fill it in with dirt, and then it's not stable. How to make that fence post stable? Wiggle it and put in more dirt. Then wiggle it some more and put in more dirt. You do that 3, 4, 5, 10 times, and finally that fence post is pretty secure. That is how Purva-paksha Siddhanta works. Shankara has no vested interest in defeating Buddhists. He does have an interest, however, in teaching Vedanta to Vedantins. And that's what he's doing here by introducing these other schools of thought, like Shunyavada Buddhism, like Kshanika Vijnanavada, which is another school of Buddhism. There are two features about the school of, again, this is not an introductory text, so if we're going to introduce these Kshanika Vijnanavadins as a Purva-paksha, as opponents, so to speak, then we need to know something about their vada, about their doctrine. And these two words, Kshanika and Vijnana, come into their name. So Shunyavada is the teaching of nothingness, which was associated with Nagarjuna and others. This Kshanika Vijnanavada, though, was associated with many others. Names don't escape me. I think Vimalakriti. That's not the name I'm looking for. Anyway, it doesn't come. Doesn't make any difference. The name that is given to their doctrine, Kshanika means momentary, Vijnana means consciousness in this context. But that word Vijnana suggests two things. I'm sorry, this Kshanika Vijnana suggests two things. The main thing we've discussed in some other context earlier in this text, that there is no constant consciousness, but rather every thought, every experience comes along with its own consciousness. So thoughts are innately conscious, when that innately conscious thought pops into your mind, it's known. When that innately conscious thought disappears, then there's nothing. Then another thought pops into your mind, oh, I get it, and another thought. So there are flickers of consciousness that give the idea of continuity, and if they had television sets in ancient times, they would definitely use a TV set or a movie as a metaphor for kshanika vijnanavada, because many of you know that when you watch TV or a movie, you're watching a series of still images. A TV will show you 30 or 60 still images every second, and they go by so fast that it looks continuous. In a movie theater, you only get 24, but you get a bigger screen. But it's 24 images per second, and it gives the feeling of continuity. This is how the Vijnanavadins describe your experience right now. And the way they say, whatever you're experiencing right now, it's gone. Whatever you're experiencing right now is gone. Whatever, you get the point? Moment by moment by moment going. And it's a powerful teaching. You can see why they embraced this teaching. It's it's kind of a radical way of understanding experience. Chop it up into these little moments. And certainly that shows mithyatva. One thing Vedanta and Buddhism are in complete agreement on is whatever is out there ain't out there. It's not as real as it seems. Of course, the way Buddhism, again, different schools of Buddhism, I'm having lots of trouble today. That's always fun. A little brain fog and dizziness as always. Anyway. The way Buddhism and the various schools of Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, the way they establish the unreality of the world is different. But they agree on the unreality of the world. The world is not as real as it seems. Full agreement there. But here we're not talking about the world. We're now talking about your experience. And this particular school of Buddhism says that what you think is continual experience is not. They're little flickers. That word kshanika means momentary. Kshanika vijnana is often translated as not moments of consciousness, but flickers of consciousness. It sounds more suggestive. And of course, in Advaita Vedanta, we've negated it in a section we saw before, and we're going to negate it again here. But again, the reason Shankara is bringing up this momentary consciousness doctrine is not to show that Vedanta is great and wonderful and all these other doctrines are useless. That's not his point. His point is to help us understand what the ancient rishis taught as part of our process of self-inquiry. We're not, just remind ourselves, this is not a philosophy class. We are not studying Buddhist philosophy and Vedanta philosophy. In fact, whenever someone uses the term Vedanta philosophy, I cringe. Really. It is such a horrible misunderstanding. You've taken this wonderful spiritual tradition and reduced it to mere philosophy. Yet, how often is it called? Vedanta philosophy. Anyway, so one more thing to share with you before we dive into this quote philosophy. That term kshanika vijnana suggests two things. One is the momentariness of your experience. Also something else, that term vijnana is often used to describe a philosophy, and I mean that deliberately, a philosophy known in the West as idealism. The philosophy of idealism in the West began long before Shankara. It began with Plato. And what Plato says is that what you're seeing is not real. It's the idea of what you're seeing that's real. So it's not a building that's real, it's the idea of building that's real. This leads to a doctrine that's called idealism, and in simple words, it's all a projection of your mind. Now, Vedanta has its own version of idealism. Vedanta's version of idealism is whatever you experience is the contents of your mind. That's a kind of idealism. This is Vedantic idealism. That is, that you do not directly experience the world outside. You only directly experience what's happening in your mind. And through your eyes and ears, etc., a model of the world around you is created in your mind, and it is that model of the world that you directly experience. That is we can call that Vedantic idealism. But that's very different than Plato's idealism and the idealism of the school of Buddhism that says there's no world out there at all. And this is you watch that Matrix thing, movies, this Matrix movies. Is kind of based on they want to show a kind of idealism. So in the Matrix, you live in a whole world. So that matrix in which the matrix that the movies present, in which you live, I think probably you've all watched it. That is kind of the Buddhist view of the world. That is, it's all a simulation. They like that kind of language. There's no world at all. We live in a simulation, or in the idea of this Matrix movie, we live in a computer program, which is that's a stretch. But that's kind of the basis. We are all like, what a funny image. We are all bugs in the computer program because we don't think it's a computer program. We're buggy computer code. I don't know. It's a little nebulous. Anyway, it's a fascinating idea, and it gives us an idea. It's helpful to the extent that it helps us understand what idealism is. But the difference is Vedanta says there's something out there. Just because what you directly experience is what's in your mind doesn't mean there's nothing out there. Doesn't mean that what's out there is a dream or illusion. There's something out there. Vedanta says whatever is out there is there, but it's not absolutely real. This is Vedanta. What the school of Buddhism wants to say is what you experience is what's in your mind, and there's really nothing out there. That is idealism. This is easily understood by saying the world is a projection of your mind. And the school of Vijnanavada is often known as the mind-only school of thought. That whatever is mind only. So that word vijnana means not consciousness in our Vedantic sense. It means consciousness in their sense. Vijnana does mean consciousness, but not consciousness as you and I understand. Consciousness as they understand. And they understand consciousness in the form of thoughts is everything you experience, which sounds very much like Vedanta. Consciousness in the form of thoughts is everything you experience, but they reject anything outside of the mind. Mind only. Okay? So this is a brief introduction. There's much more we could say. A brief introduction to Vijnanavada. Now, let's see this verse. He says, Bhinnaha apihi buddhihi atma. Atma, which is buddhi, what in the world does that mean? To a Buddhist, to a Buddhist, it means vijnana. It means consciousness in the form of thoughts. Consciousness in the form of thoughts. To a Vedantin, it means experience. I mean, we've had this, in fact, we just got done talking about this Pratibhimbavada. Consciousness reflected and conditioned by the mind is experience. Buddhyatma, if a Vedantin were using this word, and Shankara is obviously, but he's actually giving a Buddhist point of view, but we could certainly see it, Buddhyatma, Atma, consciousness, in the Buddhi, reflected in the Buddhi. Therefore, I've translated it as experience. It was kind of fascinating. It's a tricky use of the word, buddhyatma. Consciousness, which is, we'll say consciousness in the form of thoughts, I think is the most accurate presentation. It's a tricky concept. And just for fun, I have several translations. Every translation takes it differently. So one translator says mind, another translator says experience, another translator says thought, another translator says consciousness. How's that? That's a sign that you're getting into some complex material when translators can't agree on how to translate it. Anyway, we will stay with experience, but that's a shorthand for consciousness in the form of thought, which is how the Buddhists look at it. Remember, though, that for the Buddhist, consciousness in the form of thought means there's no other consciousness but thoughts, which is not the Vedantic understanding of consciousness. Okay, this is heavy, right? Yeah. So whenever, let's just back up and get the big picture here. The big picture is, this is heavy. what can I say? So here, Shankara is introducing a very powerful Buddhist teaching, which is similar to Vedantic teachings. And I think for us, there are two ways to approach these really heavy passages. For someone who's highly skilled, someone who's been through all this alone, I guess I've been through enough of it. The way we understand this is by reading one or more Sanskrit commentaries, and you really get very deeply into it. And you start seeing the brilliance of the logic and reasoning. But in our context, that logic and reasoning become an obstacle at some point. I fully appreciate it. Appreciate that fact. And here's something I'll share with you, just to put this on a little bit more comfortable footing. Before I committed myself to the study of Vedanta, I was equally attracted to Buddhism. This would go to the maybe early 1980s. I think that's when I was kind of 1 foot in Buddhism, 1 foot in Advaita Vedanta. And that's pretty tricky because the metaphor is you got 1 foot in one boat, 1 foot in the other boat, and the boats are drifting apart, which means sooner or later you got to choose. You got to choose one or the other. And there was a point when I could have jumped either way. One of the reasons I didn't jump into the boat called Buddhism is their reliance on logic. And here we can experience for ourselves the joys of all this logic. It gives you a headache. And that's not particularly helpful when you're doing atma-vichara, self-inquiry. So, Shankara's purpose here, and I'm kind of reworking my class here. Anyway, we'll see how much we can do. For us, you haven't perhaps had the chance to get into these various schools of Buddhism very deeply, and you probably haven't chance. In fact, I'm pretty sure none of you have had the chance to study the main commentary on this, and that's okay. So, what is our purpose here as we take this advanced? These verses are fairly sophisticated. So what will be our approach? Our approach will be twofold. One, you've already got the message, and that is too much logic is a headache, which should be enough to turn you off to Buddhism. Again, Buddhism, having given up access to scripture, has given up a pramana, one of the, we keep talking about Shruti, Yukti, Anubhava. They've given up one of three. These are the three legs on which our whole understanding rests, on Shruti, scriptural revelation, Yukti, reasoning, and Anubhava, your personal experience. They've given up Shruti. So when you have a table with three legs, we've given this metaphor before, you remember it, a three-legged chair is perfectly stable. A four-legged chair can wobble. Interesting observation. A four-legged chair or table can wobble. A three-legged chair or table can never wobble. And a two-legged chair like Buddhism falls right over. So this is the first thing we should appreciate before we plunge in to these teachings. It makes it very, very clear. Second thing is you are being challenged a little bit here. Even I'm being challenged because it's a challenge to make it relevant. So here we have some very sophisticated teachings. You can appreciate the sophistication of the teachings. I'll do my best to make the points clear. If you don't get it all, it's okay. It's absolutely. What difference does it mean? In your life of self-inquiry, your spiritual path of discovering your true nature as sat-chit-ananda, Atma, if you don't exactly understand what these Kshanika Vijnana Buddhists were teaching, do you miss out on anything? Nothing whatsoever. So what I'd say is understand the best you can and let the rest go. Interesting. Let me just share one more thing. Actually, what I'm doing now is I'm wasting time because I don't want to get into this verse today. So I'm trying to give you more confidence before we get into this. In the 1980s, I have a very clear memory of the first time I studied this text. It was in the 1980s. I was living in California then, and in someplace in the Bay Area. I lived in Santa Barbara, which was further south. So Pujya Swamiji had come in the mid-80s to give a camp, a residential study of this very text and this very chapter. I don't remember which verses, but he was teaching chapter 18 of this Upadesha Sahasri. And when I went, and in the mid-1980s, so I had already studied Buddhism and Vedanta and all of this. I had begun my study of Sanskrit, but it was pretty rudimentary in those days. And I sat in the classes basically with a bunch of Pujya Swamiji's long-term students who had mostly attended his 3-year course that he conducted in Northern California. So Northern California from 1979 to 1981, he conducted a 3-year course in a beautiful rural area in Northern California, almost on the border with Oregon. And most of the attendees of this camp were his students, his longtime students. And he started teaching this Upadesha. And I had already attended I had already studied with him some. I met him in 1981 and had studied as much as I could in the meanwhile with him. But I was still pretty much a neophyte. And then he got into this. I'll be honest. I sat there for 2 classes a day, I think for 5 days, and probably didn't understand a thing. That's how it was. And that was the level of teaching. And I think my purpose in sharing that anecdote with you is to say we all learn layer after layer after layer after layer. And there's no end to it either. In terms of understanding scripture, it's endless. And let me remind you, there are scholars of Vedanta who make in a few places, in Rishikesh and Varanasi, and a few places where there's a lot of scholarship, they make me look like a child. Their scholarship makes my scholarship look like I'm a newbie to them, this American newbie. You won't use such terms, I don't think. So let's be very clear here. Our goal is not scholarship at all. There's no end to scholarship. There is an end to suffering. I could make a really bad joke now. The bad joke is suffering ends when you get out of the scholarship. How's that? Because the logic gives you a headache. All right. Yet, and you're with me on all of this so far. Yet, because Shankara and other teachings make such brilliant use of logic, we have to learn enough. You don't have to be an expert. But if we just say, oh, that's all logic, who cares about it? That's not helpful. We need to know enough to use it because we're all logical people. In fact, to remember Pujya Swamiji's own words, many of our doubts and much of our confusion occur because of our improper use of logic. We use logic, but we don't use it very cleverly. We don't use it correctly. We make lots of mistakes in our logical thinking. So the value of what we're doing, which is called manana, this is, if you want to know what is manana, this is it. We're using lots of reasoning and going through lots of little stuff that you may call hair splitting. Shankara wouldn't call hair splitting. Let us say this is training us to use reasoning correctly so that we make fewer mistakes. Is it tough? Absolutely. I won't deny that. So when we meet next time, so I've delayed sufficiently so we don't have to plunge into this verse today. When we meet next time, we will start with this attitude. These are challenging teachings, this couple of verses, and we'll use reasoning so that we become more skillful, so that we become more. Reasoning is a tool. If you are clumsy with a tool, the best example, hammer is a tool. You're holding that nail. Hammer is a pretty good tool, but you better be pretty skillful in using that tool. So we need to become a little bit better in using the tool of logic. That's what we'll do in our next class. We'll see the verse at that time, and we'll end with a prayer. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Satkamaya Tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat.